My name is Rose, and I'm a nerd. I've been studying vampire stories for literally over 30 years now, so this has become my life. I do this tour. When I got to college, I declared anthropology as my major so that I could get academic credit for continuing to study vampire stories. And now, in addition to this, I do a podcast, I travel, I tell vampire stories, and I ask people from all over the world, why do we tell vampire stories? And it's a question that is very near and dear to my heart. And New Orleans is such a fantastic place to ask that question and to talk about vampire stories, because there are so many vampire stories that have been set in New Orleans over the year. And you know, it doesn't really matter what your fandom is. It doesn't really matter what your niche is. There is a vampire story set in New Orleans for everyone out there. If you're a fan of silent horror. So all of these vampire stories have been told in New Orleans over the years begin to raise the question, how long have vampire stories been told in New Orleans? And I think that I can make the very intriguing argument that vampires were among the very first boogeymen that we had to contend with. You see, the word vampire is first formally recorded in France in the year 1692, and that is not the beginning of vampire stories. That's not the beginning of vampire stories in France. That's the beginning of vampire stories in France being written down. See, when we're talking about folklore, it's important to remember there is always this gap between the arrival of a story and the recording of that story. So there are some scholars in those places, not only might you bury a suspected vampire face down in the soil with their mouths filled up with rocks or bricks to prevent them from chewing through their shroud, you might also stake a vampire, right? We've read the books, we've seen the movies, we know that that is a way to kill a vampire. But here's the thing, where vampires were staked, more often than not, they were staked with iron implements. Not 12-inch Mr. Pointies a la Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Vampires do not have paper-thin chest walls. They don't pop like a rotten balloon if you poke them the wrong way. So what the archaeological record tells us is that where vampires were staked, they were staked with iron nails, iron spikes, iron plowshares, iron knives, that sort of thing. I want you to understand, New Orleans has long been one of the murder capitals of the North American continent. 301 years of history and all of those murders over all of those years. You better best believe that a number of those homicides are going to have details about them that are decidedly and unsettlingly vampiric. Look after everyone else. This building right here is a structure that I bring everyone on all of my tours to. It doesn't matter if I'm doing a voodoo tour or a vampire tour, a combination tour, any of these tours. I want to talk about this structure because it is so important. The building is called Madame John's Legacy. It's named after a George Washington cable short story where it was a brothel, but in 1994 they dumped 20 truckloads full of dirt onto this street to recreate the old-time open sewer look that we were known for back in the day. They're filming a scene from Interview with the Vampire on this street, and in that scene, this house is the home of a very charming but ultimately very doomed family. Before I tell you what, I'm just glad that she chose to actually nod to real historical events, just as I appreciate the nod to vampire-like burial customs that show up in the film Interview with the Vampire, if you know what to look for. So the scene is the one where Louis' voiceover informs the audience together they finished off entire families. They would be Claudia, the child vampire, and Lestat, her accomplice. Claudia is entertaining the family, playing a very accomplished piece on the pianoforte. Everyone thinks she is a child prodigy, a Mozart-like genius. They don't realize that she's been doing this for a while. Lestat taps his cane and says, now for something on a more somber note, and she obliges, transitioning into funeral music. And then the camera pans out. What happens next is kind of blink and you miss it, but I don't want you to miss it. Watch the movie again more carefully, perhaps, and observe as the pallbearers are carrying the coffins of the dead family members out of the house down to the street below where there are hearses parked and waiting, and those hearses are facing opposite directions. That's not a simple cinematic stylistic choice on the part of the director. That's communicating something essential about these vampire-like burial customs. What they're showing you in that scene, we would have called that confusing the dead, confusing the corpse, confusing the spirit. There's a damn good reason for all of this confusion. I tell you what, we know that the dead could rise. That is a thing that happened here. See, we're a swamp, and it rains a lot here. But before we buried our dead above ground, we buried our dead in the ground. That's how we'd been taught to do it. But when you bury things in the ground, in a swamp where it rains a lot, you see where I'm going here. Yeah. Things don't stay buried. They start bubbling up to the surface. Coffins floating down the street in a premature resurrection of the dead that no one is okay with. The best we could ever hope to do is create the illusion of distance where no distance actually exists, and hope that the newly risen vampire is not going to be able to find their way back home. So hopefully you've only got one dead relative, but you have got 2 coffins, 2 hearses. They're loaded up and they drive off down the street in opposite directions. They'll go around the block one way, turn around, do it the other way. Figure 8s in the intersection. Hearses cross each other's paths more than once. Try retracing those steps stone cold sober before you imagine doing it dead. And that's pretty clever, I've got to admit, but traditions change over time. And so this tradition starts to evolve as well. People start following these hearses with pots and pans and noisemakers. They're creating a cacophony that was encouraged to further confuse the corpse inside the coffin. It's not a huge leap from that point to the next to say, let's replace these amateur musicians with more professional ones. And these are some of the building block origins of our beloved jazz funeral tradition, which is still to this very night reserved for our most honored dead. Now, let me stress, jazz funerals trace their roots from a number of diverse sources. African-American drum circles and social dances, burial societies where every member pools their resources so that everyone can be assured a proper burial at the time of their demise. This tradition evolves. It's a gumbo tradition. It is a mixture of things that are ancient and modern, stirred together in a way that becomes increasingly relevant to us. And jazz funerals are how we affirm that life goes on even in all of our sorrow and our trauma and our sadness. But the earliest jazz funerals played very somber music en route to the cemetery. It was only after the burial was over that the mourners milling out of the cemetery gates would be met by the band leader who would call out, "Are we still alive? Are we glad to be alive?" And you say yes, because yellow fever's no joke, and you might be dead tomorrow. But if you can dance today, you do. After all, life goes on. And as the band breaks up into upbeat, jazzy gospel music, you dance in the street on the way home, waving a scrap of fabric in the air above your heads to further dispel any lingering spirits. Second line, this building of European origin in the Mississippi River Valley. It's the most significant structure in New Orleans. That building right there, it survived the fire of 1788 and 1794. It's the old Ursuline Convent, and it is deeply, deeply tied to our own specific regional vampire stories here in New Orleans. Now, the building is not a convent anymore, but the Catholic Church still owns that structure. That building right there is used as a museum, a reception venue, office space, and miscellaneous storage. And by miscellaneous storage, I mean the attic. The entirety of that cavernous third-floor attic space is just storage, according to the Catholic Church. Although nobody's allowed up there, and no public manifest of its contents have been released. In fact, the stairwell that connects the second floor of the Ursuline Convent to the third floor attic has a velvet rope across the base of it. And there's a security guard on site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, whose job it is to make sure that no one goes up to the attic of the Ursuline Convent. So what's happening up there? We know a little bit about what might be up there. We have building records that are in the public record. These old blueprints, these old schematics that date back from the construction of this property very clearly show us that when the building was being put together, there were provisions made for a brick room on the interior of the attic of the Ursuline Convent. A completely enclosed brick space on that third floor attic. It's got a brick floor, brick walls, brick ceiling, one door to that brick room. Hot air rises. There is no cross ventilation in the structure whatsoever. On a third floor attic in southeast Louisiana before the advent of air conditioning, conditions up there would be incompatible with human life in the hottest of our summer months. So why do those building schematics seem to show what appear to be long, rectangular, bed-shaped objects in that space? Well, because these are vampire stories that we're talking about. Over the years, people have decided it's because it's not the living, it's the dead, or more specifically, the undead, who are, in fact, held captive and trapped up in that brick room in the third floor attic of the Ursuline Convent. To that end, people insist you might be walking down the street between the hours of midnight and sunrise, minding your own business. Suddenly, though, you stop in your tracks, and you're almost compelled to look upwards, where you might notice that one or more of the dormer window shutters of the attic of the Ursuline Convent are blown wide open. Now, when that happens, locals say the vampires have gotten out to wreak havoc in the community. The Catholic Church, they have a different thing to say about that. They say that never happened, it's impossible to happen, that the dormer window shutters of the attic are sealed shut from the outside and they cannot be opened from within. In fact, they're nailed shut, with 77 blessed nails each. The wood is cypress wood. Cypress wood can last for centuries. It's impervious to mildew, rot, decay. Termites don't like it. The hardware is iron hinges. And the hinges, the nails, the wood, it's all been blessed by bishops, archbishops, and priests, y'all. But it's also not unusual for bishops, archbishops, and priests to bless construction materials at Catholic building sites. So maybe this isn't overkill. No, maybe to borrow another line from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, maybe this is just enough kill. Hurricane Katrina spared the French Quarter her floodwaters. What we got instead was wind damage here. In the aftermath of the storm, it was discovered that at least one, if not several, of the shutters of the attic of the Ursuline Convent were blown wide open. And when that was found out, somebody was flown in from Rome to reattach those shutters. While we were still under curfew, while the National Guard was still on the streets, while entire neighborhoods were still literally underwater, somebody was flown in from Rome to reattach those shutters because it was that critical, that crucial, that they be closed again that quickly. I mean, what the hell is going on here? People have literally died trying to get to the bottom of this, as you will find out. But I'm still finding out new information about things that happened here in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Just about a year and a half ago, I had a man take my tour who'd been in the Army National Guard after the storm. And one of the things he told me is that one of the very first things his unit was assigned to do was escort high-ranking members of the Catholic Church back into that structure. There's no lights on anywhere inside. I mean, the electrical grid has been blown for miles around. And there in the darkness and there in the shadows, he was explicitly instructed by his commanding officer, don't look at anything, don't ask any questions. And if that's not creepy as all hell, I don't know what is. Location? So, I know of locals who refuse to walk down this street after dark. They will not stand in the shadow of this building after nightfall. You see, that ship all those years ago that was supposed to bring brides for the citizens in New Orleans and failed to do so, that it was not brides for Christ nor brides for men that were brought on board that vessel, but brides of the devil himself, which you can and you should interpret as a vampire story, because not all vampires are called vampires. All over Europe, you have the Lamia, the Strix, the Strega, the Uper, the Vampire. You've got the Drager in Scandinavia, the Chongqing in China, the Vrikla in Greeks. You've got the Sukoyam throughout the Caribbean, and in Haiti, the Lougarou, as we have mentioned here in New Orleans. When we speak of the Fiac, the stories that we tell are always reflections of us. Individually and collectively, they're communicating our fears, our values, our taboos, our expectations. That is the function of storytelling. But stories that get passed down across the generations like this, they're also a form of time travel. Remember that. It's a way for the past to communicate very important messages to the present and beyond that we ignore at our own peril. Is it possible they're the least of your concerns? Take off your haunted history stickers. Nothing says mug me, I'm a tourist, like a haunted history sticker when you're no longer on a tour. That is the end of our time together, formally at least.
Great.
Informally, well, thank you so much.
Very well done.
I have a few more things that
And there you have it, Haunted History's Vampire Tour. Now, Haunted History has been featured on the History Channel, A&E, and the Today Show, so they're very top rated. I have our amazing tour guide, Rose, here. Rose, I must say, that was a blast. I love personally how you went into the folklore behind it, because that's always been my interest, and we learned how to kill a vampire tonight, which is important. And
yes.
So tell us, when someone comes to New Orleans, why should they go with Haunted History? What's your specialty?
Well, Haunted History is the oldest continually operating paranormal walking tour company in New Orleans. We've been doing this for over a quarter century, so we know our stuff. And the Vampire Tour celebrated its 20th anniversary last year, so now we're officially old enough to drink. So if you want to come out with the best and the most experienced and the ones who were the originals, the ones who set the precedent, the one that everyone else out there is, you know, sort of a lovely deviation from, then you come and take a tour with us.
So they're kind of like the Dracula come latelys. I just made it up, that's terrible. I'm so sorry.
No, it's quite all right. I was actually thinking that was kind of clever.
So, again, it was just a great tour, especially about the Ursuline nuns.
The Ursuline nuns, that is a story that, has layers to it.
I was getting chills when I heard that part. I'm like, okay, and that doesn't happen a lot to me because, you know, I'm usually chill-free, but I got chills on that one, so thank you for the chills on that one.
So glad.
So,
it's doing my job.
Now, how can they get in contact with Haunted History? Where can we find them?
Very simple. We're on the internet. HauntedHistoryTours.com. We're also on Instagram, so check out our Instagram feed, follow us, and say hello. And
don't forget to follow our awesome guide, Rose, at Rose_Sinister.
So RoseSinister.com.
RoseSinister.com.
That's a portal to all of my social media, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, anything, RoseSinister.com, that's the best way to do it.
Ooh, a portal. Portal's interesting.
Portal.
Thank you again for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like or subscribe, comment, share with a friend. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the journey. I think that went well.
I think that went really well.
Awesome.